Greetings, vinyl community. Today I'm going to be speaking mainly about one particular album, and that is the new release from the Frank Zappa Vaults, Funky Nothingness. But I'll start off and end up with a few other albums just for the sake of variety. I can start off with 3 jazz albums on Blue Note that surprisingly came into my local shop. You do not see a lot of vintage jazz in that shop, certainly not old Blue Notes. And I was delighted because I'd walked in wearing a Blue Note t-shirt, and the owner said, "Oh, that's funny, you're wearing a Blue Note t-shirt and we just got a bunch of Blue Notes in." And I said, "Oh yeah?" And this is one that everybody was showing about a year ago when it got reissued, but this is an original of Cornbread by Lee Morgan. This is a great album with Hank Mobley on tenor, Jackie McLean on alto, Herbie Hancock on piano, Larry Ridley on bass, and Billy Higgins drums. And this apparently was a birthday present from somebody named Scott. It's got a little message there dated March 22nd, 1967. These 3 Blue Note albums are all albums that were released in 1967. Although recorded in 66 and 65, including this other Lee Morgan album, Delightfully Morgan. And this one has Joe Henderson on tenor, McCoy Tyner on piano, Bob Cranshaw on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums again. This is a slightly later pressing than the other 2 I got. This has the label with the Division of Liberty Records on it, and does not have a Van Gelder stamp in the dead wax as the other 2 do. Finally, I got a Horace Silver album, the Jody Grind, unusual gatefold production for a Blue Note album. They were kind of sparing no expense on this release, with Horace Silver, I think, probably being one of their biggest earners. This has Woody Shaw on trumpet and the very underrated James Spaulding on alto sax and flute. Fantastic flute player. I wish he would play flute all the time. Tyrone Washington on tenor, Horace Silver on piano, and we got Larry Ridley again on bass and Roger Humphreys on drums. There's the crowd, including Alfred Lyon, the A&R and producer. There was actually also a copy of the classic Horace Silver album, Song for My Father, but the owner didn't want to sell that. He was keeping that one for himself. So, main order of business is to talk about Nothing, or specifically Funky Nothingness, this beautiful, shiny, purple album from the Frank Zappa Vaults. And this is a very special release because it documents a time in Zappa's career that there's been very little documentation of. It was a very short period that took place after Zappa dissolved the original Mothers of Invention. And he made a famous appearance at the festival in Amougy in Belgium, and there he met Ainsley Dunbar and played with the Ainsley Dunbar Retaliation. He brought Ainsley Dunbar over to California and set him up to live there with him, and formed a new band. This was basically going to be the Hot Rats band. He'd released the Hot Rats album in 1969. So setting up a new band, he was doing some gigs locally in Southern California with a couple of different lineups. He had a drummer named Ed Green. He had Sugarcane Harris playing violin and organ and doing vocals. He had the faithful Ian Underwood, I believe that he had Art Tripp from the Mothers of Invention doing a gig or two instead of Ed Green, so it was kind of a period of flux. And this album is taken primarily from sessions done at the record plant in Hollywood with a lineup of Frank Zappa, Sugarcane Harris on violin and organ, Ian Underwood on saxophone and keyboards, Max Bennett, the famous session player, Wrecking Crew member, on bass, Ainsley Dunbar on drums. And it's a very jam-oriented album. They hadn't really gotten a lot of new material together, but they were working their way towards it, because this album presents some jams that were basically pilfered from. They improvise, and then Zappa would edit the material, find the good bits, and turn it into a composition that would go on an album somewhere. But I think what happened to this phase of Zappa's career was that also this is early 1970, but also in early 1970, he got an offer to perform at UCLA with the LA Philharmonic. And so he jumped at the chance to hear his orchestral music performed by the LA Philharmonic, conducted by Zubin Mehta. But there was a catch, which was that they wanted the Mothers of Invention on the bill. And the Mothers of Invention had dissolved. And the new group he was working with wasn't exactly the Mothers of Invention, so they were kind of being billed as Hot Rats. So Zappa ended up putting together a new Mothers of Invention featuring a handful of the old members. He kept Ian Underwood, who'd been working with him all along, brought back Billy Mundy, Ray Collins. I think Bunk Gardner was in it. He had Don Preston, who was always in and out. And also Ainsley Dunbar, he retained him on drums, and Jeff Simmons on bass, who may also have done one or two of the Hot Rats gigs, of which there were very few to begin with. So, and they're not well known, although there's a bootleg that I will show from that period. So he formed that band, and they did a short tour to get warmed up for the LA Philharmonic gig. And they did that, and at that gig, Zappa met Howard Kalin and Mark Volman from the Turtles, who had recently dissolved. And they kind of got hooked into being the Mothers of Invention. So Zappa formed a new version of the Mothers of Invention with some of the guys he'd just been touring with, and Flo and Eddie, as Howard Kalin and Mark Volman came to be known. And the rest is a well-known part of Zappa's history. But in between, he did these sessions, and he was kind of working towards a follow-up to the original Hot Rats album. And what became of that was we got a few tracks from these sessions on the Chunga's Revenge album, which was half the Hot Rats follow-up that got basically aborted, and half the Flo and Eddie band. So here we get to hear how that all came together originally as a follow-up to Hot Rats. It begins with the title track, Funky Nothingness, which is actually not from the Record Plant sessions. This is from the Uncle Meat sessions in 1967, late in the year, and consists of Zappa on acoustic guitar and Primordial Grunts, as it's credited, and Motorhead Sherwood on rhythm guitar. Again, we're going back to the original Mothers, and Roy Estrada on bass. This is the booklet that comes with this album. I haven't even shown all the wonderful packaging yet. Oddly enough, this double LP, when I received it, had this booklet in the back pocket and both LPs shoved into the front pocket. I find that uncomfortable, so I've let the LPs spread out. Second track on the album is Tommy Vincent Duo 1. And this is a duet between Frank and Ainsley Dunbar. And Tommy and Vincent are Ainsley and Frank's middle names, respectively, or actually Thomas and Vincent. Ainsley Thomas Dunbar and Frank Vincent Zappa. It's a well-known story that Frank didn't even realize until he saw his own birth certificate when he needed to get a passport to go on tour in Europe, that his formal name was never Francis. His birth name is Frank Vincent Zappa. Next track on the album, Love Will Make Your Mind Go Wild. These first two tracks are very brief fragments. Love Will Make Your Mind Go Wild is a wonderful R&B cover, very joyfully sung by Sugarcane Harris. The credit is actually missing on the LP and also on the CD. There's a triple CD edition of this. But that is a cover of a song by the Penguins. And here is the original single on the Duto label. I don't know if that's the original, but this is what I found in my boxes of old singles. Very fun recording. And this is followed up with another cover version, the song associated mainly with Muddy Waters, but it's been done by many, many people. I'm a Rolling Stone, also known as Catfish Blues. Long, rambling, 12-minute plus rendition. And it's amazing to hear, because what happened with this recording was that Frank took the rhythm track and wiped out everything else that we hear on this. This had to be, like much of the material on here, this had to be reconstructed, because Frank had cut up these tapes and repurposed and reused them and resequenced them in various ways. So Vaultmeister Joe Travers had to do yeoman's work in getting this all put together from the fragments that were left behind for posterity. Anyway, Frank took that rhythm bed, stripped off the vocals and all the lead parts, and he built up an entirely new original song on top of that rhythm track, and that's what became Stinkfoot on the Apostrophe album. So that is side one. And here is side one of this wonderful purple vinyl edition of this album. Also available on black vinyl if you have an aversion to purple, and as I mentioned, it also is available as a triple CD with a whole bunch of additional supplementary material. But carrying on with side two, we go into two tracks. This is all of side two, is not recorded at the record plant but at Zappa's home in the basement studio, and we get Chunga's Revenge. As heard on the Chunga's Revenge album, Chunga's Revenge is a power track. It's just blazingly loud and metallic and aggressive. And this is a much more laid back and kind of eerie version, rambling and contemplative. It's, again, a quite long, jammy track, over 9 minutes, and has some very spooky keyboard twinkling running through it, and kind of I think too forward a drum sound in the mix, but very, very cool to hear. And this goes into Basement Jam, which is exactly what it says on the label. It's a jam from the Basement Sessions. There's that shiny, shiny back cover. Have I even shown the inside? Just beautiful, beautiful packaging on this release. So moving on to side three, Work With Me Annie and Annie Had a Baby. Covers of the song, well, Work With Me Annie is a song that was very formative for Frank. He even mentions that song way back in the liner notes to the Cruisin' with Ruben and the Jets album. And it's a very naughty R&B number that was very controversial in the day when it was released in 1954 by Hank Ballard, who wrote the song, and his band The Royals, which was later renamed The Midnighters. So the original single exists under both names, The Royals and The Midnighters. I don't have a copy of that to show, but I can show another old Hank Ballard album. This is from 1968 and his song with the Daps, How You Gonna Get Respect If You Haven't Cut Your Process Yet. Very cool little bit of African-American pride there. So again, we get Sugarcane Harris vocals, and the original Work With Me Annie got a lot of sequels and answer records from both Hank Ballard himself and other artists. So this Annie Had a Baby is one of the sequels to Work With Me Annie, and so they've just made a medley of those two. This is followed up with Tommy Vincent Duo 2, which is more of the duo improvisation between Frank and Ainsley. And on the CD edition, we get the full-length version that's all been pieced together of that improvisation where Frank is starting out on bass and then transitions to guitar during the improv. And finally, to end side 3, Charlena 1970 Record Plant Mix. And this is the 12-minute epic version that has been previously released on the Lost Episodes CD with, again, Sugarcane Harris vocals. Charlena itself was, of course, released on the Chunga's Revenge album, along with some other song, well, obviously the song Chunga's Revenge, which is on this, but some other tracks edited down from lengthier improvisations that we hear on the triple CD edition of Funky Nothingness. This is a German pressing of Chunga's Revenge. I actually happened to buy this at a record store in San Francisco on the night that Frank Zappa died, which of course I didn't know at the time. It wasn't made public until about 2 or 3 days later. Got the booklet. Moving on to side 4. These are the two songs, both quite substantial songs that are really new compositions and not jams or alternate versions of songs that we have elsewhere in the Zappa catalog. The first is Khaki Sack, which is a very sprightly instrumental. It's definitely got that kind of Hot Rats DNA to it and would have been a beautiful inclusion if there had been a genuine Hot Rats 2. The next time the Hot Rats name appeared was on the Waka Jawaka album in 1972. And then Hot Rats 3 was the working title for the album that eventually became Sleep Dirt several years later. But Khaki Sack definitely would have been a nice match for any of those. And the whole thing ends with the epic, almost 12 minutes, Twinkle Tits. A beautiful multi-part instrumental with a nice waltz theme to it. And this is a track that we knew from that bootleg LP that I alluded to earlier, Frank Zappa, Hot Rats at the Olympic. This is a very early Frank Zappa bootleg on the Trademark of Quality label, which I've kept in the original shrink wrap so the paper insert won't fall apart. But, there it is. This is a bootleg that I've had for a very long time, and it includes Twinkle Tits, announced by Frank, and so I've always wished that we had a clear version of that track, because this is not the greatest sound quality in the world by any means. So, hey, it's a prayer answered on this album. So as I say, what remained of these sessions became Chunga's Revenge. And that's all we've known, basically, until now, except for the little bits that were released on the Lost Episodes CD, and also on this strange release called Quadiophilia, which, or Quadiophiliac, which got a little tiny C at the end. This is an audio-only DVD which includes the basement version of Chunga's Revenge. So that is the other track besides Charlena that has been released before. But this was not a very popular format, and I don't think a whole lot of copies of this sold. Just for the record collecting value, here's another copy of Chunga's Revenge. This is the color variation that was released in the UK. It's the same tracks, just differently colored. And if you get bored with a red album, you can have that, or you can have this Mexican version, which actually translates the title as La Venganza de Chunga. They do an interesting translation also of the track that is not on the LP version of Funky Nothingness, but does appear on the CD edition. There's a very, very lengthy overdubbed percussion extravaganza by Frank, playing a whole bunch of drums and percussion and just overdubbing himself into oblivion. And it was cut down to a minute and a half for the Chunga's Revenge album entitled The Clap. And the Mexican release translates that as El Aplauso. I don't think that's an accurate translation. El Aplauso, the applause. Yes, Frank was singing about applause. Well, there's no singing. He was drumming about applause. So that's my take on Funky Nothingness. I think it's not nothing at all. It's really because there is so much jamming, particularly on the CD edition, where you're getting a lot of the improvisation that the finished works were drawn from and alternate versions. I've heard some negative rumblings from people who say, oh, this is just jamming, this is not worth releasing, this was stuff that wasn't good enough to release at the time. And I can't understand these objections, because if you want the stuff that Frank Zappa wanted released, the stuff that was finished and he was satisfied with and was good enough for release, well, that was all out in the world by the 1990s. So everything since then, everything in the 21st century is bonus. If all you want is the stuff that was fit for release during Frank's lifetime, you've got it, it's done, you don't have to worry about any more. And let the rest of us fanatics hear the amazing stuff that they're coming up with out of the vaults. Excuse me. So just to polish off a few other records, I found two records quite recently by Neil Ardley, the British composer. And these are both records that are sort of in the interface of Brit jazz, orchestral classical music, and epic prog music in the vein of, say, Mike Oldfield. Great players on both of these. Barbara Thompson is on woodwinds on both of these. Trevor Tompkins on percussion. Dave McRae on keyboards from Matching Mole. Jeff Castle on keyboards. Ian Carr on trumpet and flugelhorn. So Nucleus is a strong touchstone. But I found both this Kaleidoscope of Rainbows from 1975 and Harmony of the Spheres from 1979, with a lot of the same players, Jeff Castle on keyboards, Trevor Tompkins on percussion, Barbara Thompson, Tony Coe, Ian Carr, and others. Wonderful stuff if you're into prog rock, if you're into Brit jazz. Finally, an album that's probably quite common, but I've never seen it mentioned on the VC, and it's worth a mention because I think it's a really good album. I just recently ran across this copy. Freedom Suite by the Rascals. And this ties in with Funky Nothingness, not only because I bought this on the same day that my copy of Funky Nothingness arrived. Oh, I forgot one thing from the Funky Nothingness Purple Vinyl Limited Edition. You also get a guitar pick with a picture of Frank on one side and the mustache logo on the other, with the LP number of its order in the Zappa universe. So it's nice of them to include that. Back to the Rascals. Freedom Suite. one of, I think, 3 albums I have in my collection titled Freedom Suite. This was released in 1969, and it includes 2 hit singles that they had released the previous year. The amazing People Got to Be Free, that's the song I want played at my funeral, and A Ray of Hope, and then the song Heaven, which was released as a single just before the LP release. So those songs are all on here. But it's a very cool, socially conscious album. A lot of this album is about peace, quelling unrest, and brotherhood. And I think I interrupted myself. I was saying what this has in common with Funky Nothingness, and that's the silver foil cover. Oh, and the inclusion of bonus material, which is falling out here. You get a little plastic bag here with artwork by the Rascals. Copy of an El Greco there. So you get 3 of them did artwork that are on those, and then the 4th is printed inside the gatefold itself. This being a double LP, all the regular songs are on the first disc, and the second disc is the jam disc. So another similarity with Funky Nothingness, that there's some long instrumental jamming on here with some great players. David Fathead Newman is on this. King Curtis plays a tenor solo on one of the, not on the jams, but on the regular songs. Chuck Rainey is on bass. But the second disc consists of 3 tracks: Adrian's Birthday, which is a sort of jazz rave-up, and then a 13-minute drum solo by Dino Danelli titled Boom, which is thematic. He doesn't just sit down and go all around the drums. He's actually coming up with themes and variations. Not really complex themes, but it's there. There's a logic to it. And finally, all of side 4 is Cute, which is a sidelong 15-minute jam, credited to all of the Rascals. That's it. Thank you very much for watching. Talk with you again soon. Be well. Bye-bye for now.